joining and zooming in. Um, as Ari suggested, this is a topic, Black-Jewish relations, that I wrote about a number of years ago, but it's kind of stormed back into the public consciousness for a variety of reasons. And, I got to thinking, and I was, especially now that I'm teaching students, and their memory, obviously, in many cases, doesn't go much back beyond September 11th. I mean, many of them weren't even born back on September 11th. And so a lot of things seem like distant history for them. But I found myself imagining that if someone had gone to sleep in 1971, excuse me, or dropped into a coma and woke up 50 years later, what would it be like for them to kind of look at the American scene? And we would be telling that person that the newly elected vice president was a woman of color, the daughter of a Black father and a South Asian mother, and that her husband was a Jewish lawyer. We would tell that person that America had elected its first African American president and that Jewish voters had voted overwhelmingly for him and typically vote for Black candidates in elections at a far greater level than other whites. And we would tell this person who had maybe gone into a coma in 1971 that in Georgia, of all places, a history with a long history of racism and anti-Semitism, where Leo Frank was lynched, where Blacks were attacked, that they had just elected a Black senator and a Jewish senator, and that the two had campaigned together, worked to win Black and Jewish voters, and had basically tipped the Senate over to the Democratic Party. I think with just those kind of talking points, somebody waking up after a 50-year slumber would think that America was in great shape and that things between Blacks and Jews was terrific. But of course, we know that that's not true. And I want to talk a little bit about what has happened over the past 50 years and what it tells us about things going forward. Because I think increasingly when we look at what Blacks and Jews have gone through, the way they came together, the way they've fallen apart, it may have some lessons about how fractured our country is today and what we can do to kind of stitch it back together. I think, as we all know too well, relations between Blacks and Jews are very tense and uncertain today. Many of us watch Black activists and politicians nervously, worried about the anti-Semitic comments that are coming out of Black Lives Matter, the attacks on Zionism in Israel, the comments that Black celebrities sometimes make about Jews. And for their part, when I talk to Black activists or even to my students, I find that many of them view Jews with suspicion, believing that somehow Jews say that they're allies, but in fact that Jews put their own interests first and really aren't prepared for hard discussions about racism in this country. And of course, we live at a time when polarization is growing, when racists and anti-Semites march together in Charlottesville, synagogue in Pittsburgh is attacked and Jews are killed, hate crimes against all groups, whether it's Jews, Blacks, Asian Americans, Latinos, are at record levels. And so for me, the question isn't just about Blacks and Jews, but it's about the country and how we got here and what we can maybe do to sort of turn the arc of history back in the right direction. I want to start a little bit with history, and I think reminding ourselves that the roots of Black-Jewish cooperation go very deep. Certainly when we sing at our Passover Seder, "Let my people go," that is a recognition of the spirituals that many enslaved Black people sang when they were living in the South and turned to the Old Testament with its stories of Moses leading his people to freedom and to the promised land. The way many Blacks first got to know about Jews was through these Negro spirituals and through the stories of the Bible. The way many Jews got to know about Blacks initially was as common victims of persecution. Jews who came to America fleeing persecution in Russia, Germany, Eastern Europe, saw in the discrimination against Blacks a common cause. The Forward, the famous Jewish newspaper, in 1917 wrote about a white-led riot in East St. Louis that killed 39 Blacks. And the Forward compared that attack to the Kishinev pogrom in Russia, when more than 50 Jews were killed. And the Forward wrote in Yiddish, Kishinev and St. Louis, the same soil, the same people, 4,500 miles between these two cities, yet they are so close and so similar to each other. Blacks and Jews began working together early on. Jews were instrumental in the founding of the NAACP, the National Urban League. The first presidents of the NAACP were Jewish, the Spingarn brothers. Julius Rosenwald, the Jewish founder of Sears Roebuck, built schools for black children across the South and worked very closely with Booker T. Washington. So this was not kind of a new alliance that came together in the 60s. It was something that blacks and Jews had been working on for many decades before that. But it did reach its culmination in the civil rights movement. And when we look back at the 1960s, and we look back at the freedom rides and the whites who went down south to fight for racial justice, one of the things that's striking is how prominent Jews were among the whites who joined that movement. Probably 2/3 of the whites who went down south for the freedom rides or to register voters in Mississippi were Jews from New York, from other cities. Jewish donors contributed about 3/4 of the money that was donated to support Martin Luther King and other mainstream black organizations. So when we talk about a black-white alliance during the civil rights movement, it was really in many ways an alliance between blacks and Jews. And this was brought home tragically in the summer of 1964 when Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, two Jewish civil rights activists and a black civil rights activist, were murdered by white racists in Mississippi. This idea of sharing a common enemy, I think, was incredibly important for those early days of black-Jewish cooperation. The Ku Klux Klan, many people said, the KKK, targeted Coons, Kikes, and Catholics. And blacks and Jews understood that. And when we look back, the changes that the civil rights movement wrought, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, really never could have come to fruition without these two groups working together. And in fact, in Washington, it was often black and Jewish lawyers working together who helped write those civil rights acts and then lobbied to get them passed in Congress. But I think one thing we sometimes forget as Jews is that Jews were motivated not only by common ideals or by the sermons they heard from their rabbis or by their own experience in the Holocaust or with anti-Semitism, but also by common interests. Jews were among the first to use the anti-discrimination laws, the Civil Rights Acts, to eliminate restrictive covenants that kept them out of apartment buildings and suburban housing. The growing tide of tolerance fostered by the civil rights movement opened opportunities for African Americans, but it also opened up opportunities in law firms, corporations, and universities for Jews. And we have to acknowledge that the rapid ascent of Jews in America since the 1960s owed a huge debt to the civil rights movement and the way the civil rights movement changed the way Americans thought of themselves and the kind of country they wanted to be. The problem is that by the late 1960s, even after all these triumphs, blacks and Jews were often at each other's throats. And in some ways, what we're going through now reminds me a little bit of what the late 1960s were like. Back then, there was a great period of optimism with Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, John F. Kennedy, the Great Society. These days, we kind of celebrated the election of Barack Obama and believed we had maybe entered a new phase. But both in the late 1960s and today, it turned out that that optimism was misplaced. As is true today, in the late 1960s, younger black leaders, Stokely Carmichael back then, Rap Brown, a number of others, began calling for radicalization of the civil rights movement. They attacked the white power structure, and they expelled white allies, including many Jews. In fact, when I talked to Jews about this time, many of them took it very personally, the way they had worked in the civil rights movement, had contributed money, had gone down south. but now found young Black leaders saying that they didn't want Jews around, they didn't want whites around, that this had to be a Black-led movement. Another thing that happened in the late 60s was that the civil rights movement moved from the South to the North, to New York, to Chicago, Los Angeles, where Jews often held many positions of power and positions that brought them into close and often unequal relationship to Black people. In the South, things seemed clearer. There were the white racist and the sheriffs with their dogs attacking Blacks, the history of Jews being afraid to speak out in the South. But in the North, Jews and Blacks often were in very close proximity. Jews were landlords, or they owned stores in Black neighborhoods. They were school teachers and social workers. In fact, one of the jokes in the 1960s was that of the 5 people a poor Black person met in the course of the day, the landlord, the store owner, the teacher, the social worker, and a cop, 4 of them were Jewish, and one, the cop, was probably Irish. Not all these encounters were positive. Some of them were, but certainly when you talk to Blacks, many of them felt that Jewish landlords were overcharging them, Jewish store owners overcharged them. And there were battles in New York and elsewhere over control of schools and the role of teachers' unions, which were heavily Jewish, versus African Americans who wanted more control over their education. Another thing that happened that I think is not often talked about, but I think personally many Jewish families went through, was the change in neighborhoods. In city after city, Blacks began to move into neighborhoods as Jews were leaving. And very often, Jews felt that they were being forced to leave. The reason for this often had to do with redlining and the desire of Jews to move to better housing. But for many Blacks, this was kind of a point of resentment that, if Jews supported the civil rights movement down south, why did they feel differently when Blacks began to move into their neighborhood? And Jews, of course, began to worry about the rise in crime and felt that it wasn't safe to live in neighborhoods where Blacks were moving in. And so there was another kind of rubbing against each other, which produces real tension and sometimes real anger. And the other thing that happened in the late 1960s was the Six-Day War. And I think it's hard, certainly for my students or probably anyone, under 60 these days, to remember what the Six-Day War did to American Jews. The sense of peril that so many American Jews felt before the Six-Day War, and the kind of exaltation and feeling of happiness when Israel defeated the Arabs in the Six-Day War. But one of the things the Six-Day War did was that it basically thrust Israel into the middle of what became an ongoing international debate over the occupation of the West Bank and the territories, the dilemma of the Palestinians. And it was an issue that Jews had very strong feelings about across the political spectrum, but certainly, most Jews supporting Israel, even as it went through various political changes. At the same time, many African Americans began to feel the need to speak out on behalf of other oppressed groups like the Palestinians and others, and began to draw Israel into American debates. So we all know what happened in the years that followed the late 1960s. Blacks and Jews spent the next decades arguing about affirmative action, about Israel, about Louis Farrakhan, about the presidential campaigns of Jesse Jackson. And these were very often bitter and hard-fought arguments. And one of the effects they had was that it really weakened the Democratic Party. With 2 of its most important constituent groups feuding over so many issues in the 70s and the 80s, and really into the 90s, the Democratic Party lost 4 of the 5 presidential elections that were fought during that time. And it wasn't until Barack Obama ran for president in 2008 that Blacks and Jews were able to reconstitute a semblance of their old political alliance with the energy that was necessary to help recapture the White House. Even though Obama was the first African American president, Jews supported him overwhelmingly. Obama himself had very close relationships with Jewish advisors in Chicago. He knew the Jewish community very well. He built a very strong alliances there. And I think Jews felt very comfortable with Obama, not just as a president, not just as an African American, but as someone who understood the kind of America that blacks and Jews wanted to create. And it was Barack Obama, an African American president, who held the first Passover Seder in the White House. He held it because many of his aides were Jewish, and he wanted to recognize for them how important it was to recognize the role that Jews had played in this country, but also the connections and alliances that blacks and Jews had. But today, obviously, things are different. And I think we know that the comments, the anti-Semitic comments that have come out of Black Lives Matter, at times even in the Women's March, have been very troubling to Jews, as well as the kind of comments that get popularized by Black celebrities and Black athletes. More seriously, and I hear this from my students a lot, many Blacks basically feel that Jews have become white. That Jews may see themselves as a minority, may talk about themselves as not having much power. But to many African Americans, Jews are white. They participate in white institutions. They've risen very high in universities, companies, the Supreme Court, Congress, you name it. And that Jews are part of, what's called these days white privilege. I think that's an issue that many Jews have a hard time with, since we still see ourselves in many ways as outsiders or a minority, but that's not the way many Blacks see Jews. And I think that Israel continues to be a flashpoint. Many Black politicians and Black activists, especially young people, increasingly are upset and criticize the treatment of the Palestinians. They've launched attacks on Zionism. And these are criticisms that, some Jews certainly agree with, but when it spills into attacks on Zionism and Israel, feel that they are really crossing a line, which many Jews are very worried about. And the rise of BDS, the boycott, disinvestment movement, has been very effective on campuses and elsewhere, and I think thrown Blacks and Jews against each other. I think beyond how Blacks and Jews deal with each other, this collapse of Black-Jewish cooperation is important because it shows how powerful coalitions can be in this country, as they were in the 1960s. None of us would want to live in a world that existed before the Civil Rights Movement. But it also shows how fragile they can be. And we're certainly at a point now where all coalitions seem incredibly fragile. I think a number of things have changed in the country, demographically and politically, that makes this time, in a way, a time that is harder to build coalitions, but also a time that really needs coalitions more than ever. As we all know, we've become a country that is going to be majority minority. In California, we see that more powerfully than just about anywhere else. No one group, no one party has a majority. We all need coalitions, whether it's the way politicians slice and dice white working class whites, college educated women, Latinos, Jews, African Americans. Every group needs to form connections with other groups to try to move an agenda forward. At the same time, I think there's a changing landscape within the Jewish community, which is going to present challenges to Jews going forward. One thing that's striking is that by some estimations, 20% of Jews these days, of younger Jews, especially in the Reform movement, are Jews of color. These are Jews some of whom have been adopted, some of whom have come to the Reform movement through conversion. But Jews of color are a real force now, certainly within the Reform Jewish community, to the point that a number of the American Jewish organizations have offices to deal with this. There are Korean American rabbis. Michelle Obama has a cousin who's an African American rabbi, a rabbi who converted. And hearing these Jews of color talk can be sobering because they will talk about how they often don't feel welcome when they go to synagogues or when they try to raise certain issues in the Jewish community. And I think that's something that we need to think about. Another change that's going on is the rise of the Orthodox. Obviously, we've seen in Israel the rise of the Hasidim and of the religious parties in Israel. That's beginning to happen, not to the same extent, but certainly in New York, the Orthodox Jews are becoming a very powerful group. In fact, Eric Adams, the African American who won the Democratic primary in New York for mayor, won in large part because of Jews. But they weren't the progressive Jews on the Upper West Side or elsewhere. They were the Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn, which really helped Eric Adams. And so what that suggests is that within the Jewish community, there may be increasing complexity as we deal with the concerns of the Orthodox Jews as well as progressive Jews. And this all takes place, obviously, against an obvious rise of anti-Semitism worldwide, but also in the United States. Jews are feeling more and more nervous, and they're doing so with good reasons. And so I think one of the things that Jews are starting to think about, certainly in the Jewish organizations, but I think as individuals, who can be our partners? Who can be our allies? Who can we turn to who will understand our concerns and who we can work with? And I think Blacks face the same calculus. While it may feel good for Black Lives Matter or other more radical Black groups to attack whites and kind of push the debate in a very progressive or radical direction, one of the things that obviously Biden's election showed is that you're going to need to form a coalition, and it may be a very narrow one, and groups are going to have to learn how to work together. And I think that the group that understands this the best, and that I would argue is probably the best place for Jews to look for building future coalitions and alliances, is Black politicians. Ilhan Omar, Tlaib, they get all the attention these days. But I think when we look at Black politicians, whether it's Kamala Harris or Karen Bass or Raphael Warnock, who was just elected senator in Georgia, Cory Booker, these are Black politicians who understand the way voting works. They understand the role that Jews can play, both in terms of financial support, but also organizational support, and that bringing Blacks and Jews together can advance an agenda that's very important to the Black community. They live in the real world of votes and trying to get elected. And the fact that people like Karen Bass and others have formed a Black-Jewish coalition in Congress, headed by Karen Bass, that Kamala Harris has been such an outspoken supporter of Israel, that Cory Booker has extensive and deep relations with the Jewish communities in New York and New Jersey. Like John Lewis, these are Black leaders who really are leaders. And I think sometimes it's easy for Jews to get distracted by the celebrity who says an anti-Semitic comment, or the rapper, or the athlete who says something, rather than focusing on Black politicians who have a real constituency and seeing how we can work with them. I don't want to be naive here. I think Israel is a flashpoint. I think that it's a very difficult situation. The new government in Israel may help lower the temperature of the debate, both in the Middle East and in the United States. But certainly, as long as Israel continues to be a place where there is incredible tension over where things are headed, it's going to be very difficult to avoid that question in American politics. This two-state solution would probably help, but it's unclear whether that is ever going to happen. And I also think we have to recognize that young Black activists are more radical and more critical of Israel than their parents. and that a lot of work needs to be done to work with Black activists and younger Blacks to make them understand Jewish concerns. We can't just write them off because they're going to be the future. But I do want to kind of end by talking a little bit about a source of optimism and how we can maybe build on that. Let's look at Georgia. I mean, Georgia is a place that I don't think any of us would have thought would have elected a Black senator and a Jewish senator. But what's interesting is when you look at what happened there, even when the Black-Jewish alliance crumbled in the late 1960s, Blacks and Jews in Atlanta on the local level continued to work together on local causes and for local politicians. When the Martin Luther King Center was set up in Atlanta after Dr. King's death, Atlanta's Jews stepped forward and gave enormous amounts of money to support that center. They voted for and donated to John Lewis as he rose to become one of the country's leading members of Congress. Over the past 10 years, every Friday night of Martin Luther King weekend, Reverend Warnock, who was then pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, would travel to the most prominent Jewish temple in Atlanta to preach the sermon. And that temple's rabbi, Peter Berg, would travel to Ebenezer on Sunday to preach there on Sunday of Martin Luther King weekend. That show of commitment, that trust really made a difference. Because one of the problems Blacks and Jews face is that they don't really know each other anymore. Most Jews live in the suburbs. Many African Americans live in the inner city. They don't meet in any way, in a way that happened more in the 1960s. But Atlanta, they did. In Atlanta, there were these connections, not around a crisis, but just efforts by both communities to get to know each other, even if there were these larger issues of Farrakhan and Jesse Jackson that were dominating the headlines. And as a result, when Reverend Warnock was accused during his campaign of making anti-Israel statements, Rabbi Berg, who had spoken at his synagogue, came to his defense, and a group of nearly 200 rabbis from Georgia and across the country signed a letter of support for Reverend Warnock. Similarly, when it became clear how crucial Black voters would be in the runoff, Reverend Warnock literally embraced John Ossoff, calling him his brother from another mother. And Ossoff saw his share of Black voters grow from 87% to 92% in the runoff. And that was enough to get him elected along with Reverend Warnock. Now, are there issues on which Jews are going to disagree with Reverend Warnock? Certainly there will be. Will there be issues in which Blacks may disagree with John Ossoff? I'm sure there will be. But I do think it's important to recognize that these two politicians found a way to work together for a bigger goal. And the goal was to gain Democratic control of the Senate so they could begin to try to push forward an agenda that, both men and both communities believed in. So I think looking forward, there are a couple of lessons from this. Nostalgia is tempting. And I think many Jews, when they talk about Black-Jewish relations, get very nostalgic. I'm probably as guilty of it as anyone. And we talk about Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, and we talk about the civil rights movement. Many African Americans are not nostalgic. They feel that the civil rights movement was a great moment in American history, that Jews were welcome and they welcomed their participation, but that we have to look at the reality now and look at what Jews can do as whites, as influential members of our communities and companies and the media and elsewhere, and really create change. Blacks and Jews came together in the late 1950s and the early 60s when Jews were still vulnerable outsiders. Blacks had moral power, but they lacked political or economic power. We as Jews need to acknowledge how much has changed for us in the past 50 years and how our own success in America may have been fueled unintentionally by our participation in white privilege, that we may well have benefited as other whites did. And I think that's something we need to acknowledge, but then also say, how do we then use our positions? How do we use our success to advance others and to work with African Americans? I think the Obama's victory, the rise of Kamala Harris, Reverend Warnock, and others is a sign of an emerging class of Black political leaders. These are powerful figures who will be setting the country's political agenda going forward. And we as American Jews are going to have to work with them. Blacks are going to have to consider whether, in pursuit of coalitions, it's possible to disentangle attacks on Israel and inflammatory rhetoric from the broader agenda that we all agree would help this country. There are going to have to be some tough conversations. But I think if this kind of change can happen in Georgia, it can certainly happen anywhere. Blacks and Jews don't live in a vacuum. These two groups came together at a time in the 1960s when the country was trying to come to terms with its history, and coalitions were important. Dating even back to FDR's New Deal, there was LBJ's Great Society, and then Barack Obama's desire to bring the country together. We've just emerged from 4 years of Donald Trump, which wanted to divide us and really encouraged all groups to kind of fight each other. And I think that's something that obviously President Biden is trying to change, but we need to accept the fact that, we are very often shaped by the political atmosphere around us, and we want to use all the efforts we can to try to work together, to try to get to know each other. I think that embracing a common agenda, a real alliance, is easier when Blacks and Jews know each other, when they work together on common causes, when they embrace the realities and give and take of politics. I often think of Blacks and Jews in the United States as being in an arena or a stadium surrounded by spectators. Down in the arena, Blacks and Jews are fighting with each other, right? They're arguing about Israel. They're arguing about affirmative action. They're arguing about white privilege. All these issues are there. They're landing punches on each other, refusing to give in. But my question is, who's in the audience? Who's in the arena cheering Blacks and Jews on, cheering the battle, egging them on? Well, as we know, these are the people who marched in Charlottesville. These are the people who are on the alt-right. These are people who don't like Blacks and Jews. They want to keep Blacks and Jews fighting because that weakens liberal and progressive causes. It feeds polarization, and it helps keep power in the hands of people who oppose both groups. I think we're at a moment now where both Blacks and Jews are rising in power and influence in every aspect of society. And I would urge all of them and all of us to lay down our boxing gloves for a moment and try to figure out how we can work together to make this country a better place.
Thank you. We have a good amount of time now for Q&A, and people have been sending me issues. And we have Carla Mays, who's in our audience. I want to ask her to unmute herself in just a bit because I want to hear from her. And I think she has quite an interesting background that I'm reading about. Let's start with a few questions. People, please chat. I'll kind of communicate what I've been seeing as well as questions I might have as well. Where do we start? Let's talk about your class. So you teach at Northeastern University. Do you have Jewish and Black students in your class? And what do you see going on, interactions between those students?
It's interesting. What I see is that the Jewish students are a little gun shy in that they don't quite know. They're progressive and they're liberal. They vote for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And they very much support Black Lives Matter. But when these anti-Semitic comments erupt, they're not quite sure how to respond to it. And I think part of the problem is that they have very mixed feelings, say, about Israel. They also feel that maybe as whites, they're not doing enough. And they don't really have the language or the ability to kind of advocate for their views, explain how they feel in a way that they feel people will listen to them. The students of color are interesting because, if they come from a kind of a more progressive point of view, everything is literally black and white to them. But a lot of our students actually grew up in the suburbs. They went to mixed high schools, and they're realists, and they recognize that they need white allies. And so they kind of look at Jews and say, well, you went through all these traumatic things, the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Why don't you get what we want? Why don't you just support us? And I think that one thing I've noticed is that blacks and Jews both have very sensitive antennae, right? So if someone black says to me, I think that comment was racist, I'll listen to them because I think, well, okay, they may know that. By the same token, I think when someone Jewish says, I think that may be anti-Semitic or I'm uncomfortable, I think blacks have to respect that as well. So that's what we try to do in our class. But what I'm struck by is how, the black and Jewish students, I mean, they're young, but they want to reach out to each other, but they're not quite sure how to do it.
That's very interesting that you get to see, that you get to teach it and see how it's actually playing out in reality in your university. Let's talk about BLM, because people have been asking questions about that. And it's troubling because I think the more progressive Jewish groups like the Reform Movement are supportive of BLM. And many Jews are supportive of trying to help the agenda of BLM, but they are very troubled by the anti-Semitism they see and the anti-Israel items they see. So my two questions about BLM that have come up from a conversation. One is, who is pushing these anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Israel tropes? And are they the same or are they different? And in other words, are Palestinian rights activists going into BLM and using that as a platform for themselves? Or is it coming really out of the Black leadership of BLM? And then we'll get to the next question.
I mean, it's complicated. Look, I think one thing we have to acknowledge is that the Palestinians have become very good at advocating their cause in the States. The BDS movement, whatever you think about it from a moral point of view, has been brilliantly organized. And the way the Palestinians are presenting it is very effective, and it's very effective on campuses. I mean, one of the things that I think is really troublesome is how, not at Northeastern, but a number of universities are now saying they won't go to conferences in Israel. They're voting to boycott conferences, really the opposite of what any university should be about. And so I think part of it is that the Palestinians have been very effective in their attacks on Israel, frankly. And Israel has not made it harder because in many ways, the Israelis, I think, have not been, they believe that America is AIPAC and have not been effective in working through other more liberal Jewish groups to address the BDS movement of the Palestinians, some of which then spills over, right? On a college campus, or if you're in a city, very often, if you're a radical activist, you're going to hang out with BLM people and other people. There's long been a strain in the African American community that unites the kind of Black struggle with third world struggles, whether it was in Cuba or Russia, and the Palestinians were kind of an obvious thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that's still there. And I guess that's why, rather than trying to change BLM, I think it's more important for Jews to work with Black politicians, because I think that Black politicians understand that politics is give and take, and that Jews can support, calls to end police violence and mass incarceration, things like that, which many Jews, many liberal Jews would support, but would also understand that Israel is not part of that conversation. It may be a conversation that has to be had, but they can't be tied up. And so I think that rather than try to change BLM, it's more a matter of working with other established Black organizations and Black politicians who, frankly, I think need that support because they've got to work with BLM, but they also want to work with whites. Jim Clyburn, who is a big ally of Biden's, extremely influential. I mean, he and other Black leaders understand this tightrope they have to walk. And I think we need to be a little more understanding in the sense that, if we work for and support and listen to Black leaders, then they will have more power to maybe move their organizations forward. Some of the more liberal Jewish groups are trying to work with BLM. I wish them all the success, but I don't see that strain of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism disappearing. I think it's a persistent strain among radical blacks, but not all blacks.
Right. One of the questions came out was, do these black politicians also get attacked by BLM, and how do they react to
They
that?
do. I mean, that's what's interesting. Jim Clyburn, who is, probably the most powerful African-American member of Congress, was attacked recently on the steps of the Capitol by these people saying he was a sellout and all that. And I think anybody who knows politics, I mean, it's absurd. He sort of is, one of the most powerful people in the country. And so I think that sometimes it's easy for Jews to look at a Farrakhan or to look at some of these Black Lives Matter activists and sort of say, oh my God, this is what the Black community thinks. I think in our own lives, I mean, for example, I teach this course with an African American professor, very well respected, very involved in local politics. And privately, he'll say to me, I don't want anything to do with this anti-Semitism and Black Lives Matter. And, he wants to figure out who are the Jewish leaders he can talk to help push the agenda that he wants. The Anti-Defamation League, I think, in a very interesting way, just came out and apologized for some of their criticisms of the mosque that was going to be built at Ground Zero. And it was a pretty remarkable statement where the head of the ADL said, we were wrong. We were wrong. There's no excuse. And this being the season of repentance, we are not only going to apologize, we're going to try to be better and to make it right. I think if groups like the ADL can do something similar in working with blacks, and rather than focusing on, these folks on the fringe or in the radical stream of blacks who are making these comments, instead show Jews groups they can support, groups they can work with, give Jews kind of an institutional backing and a way of looking at the world, that's much better than always finding the crazy rapper who made an anti-Semitic statement and having that be the thing that we talk about for a month.
Rochelle Amber, on that note, Rochelle Amberson, one of our longtime donors and supporters, mentioned Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's recent piece that he published on the subject, and I'll try to share it with everybody. But it was very powerful, and we should focus on things like that.
Yeah, I mean, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is great. In fact, it's interesting. We were making a list of people we wanted to bring to campus to talk about this issue. And, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is one. Jamel Harris, who's a Black woman sports writer for ESPN, has written very powerfully about, she made some comments at one point that were seen as anti-Semitic, and she met with Jews and talked about it and then realized that what she had done, and she apologized for it. I think sometimes those voices get lost because, even today we still want to talk about Farrakhan and so forth. So I think that highlighting, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has spoken out very strongly about these issues, as have a number of, one of the people we're bringing to our campus, and this is an example of how blacks and Jews can work together. The Patriots, as you say, are playing today. Bob Kraft, who's Jewish, every year takes a group of African-American players to Israel. And they go to all the Christian sites, they meet with Israeli politicians, and they come back with a deeper understanding of Israel. One of the players is actually converted to Judaism, one of the African-American players, but it's an example of kind of people spending time together and being educated. And I think if we did more things like that, where blacks and Jews, black and Jewish students, black and Jewish, teachers and others can spend time learning from each other, they're less likely to turn against someone if they know them. They're less likely to believe a stereotype if they've had dinner with them. And I think that's more of what we have to develop.
On that note, Malcolm Gisson, I take it, lives in San Francisco and is very involved in Black. He has a Black and Jewish Unity Coalition that he's been working with, and they've been addressing issues like criminal justice and prison reform, health equity, economic opportunities for minorities, and the need for low-income housing, so on and so forth, which are all excellent issues that Blacks and Jews can work on together. He has a question, which is, how can people audit your class? Is there a way for people to learn with you
Actually, what I
online?
can do is I can send you a link. It's part of the class is what's called the open classroom. And so we actually invite members of the community. Normally they come to campus, but with COVID, we're going to have them Zoom in. So I'll send that to you and you can, kind of listen to what the speakers are saying. And it's interesting. It'll be fun. So I'll send you that information.
And we have Carla Mays, and I've been reading her stuff. And Carla, if you're there, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself and join us and add to the conversation. I think you may have some things to add or questions to ask. So if you're there and you want to do it, I'm asking you, can you put on your camera?
I'm
want to.
not in a place where I can
Okay.
turn on the camera, but I'm here with you.
Well, tell us about yourself and what you want to share today.
I'm sorry you can't see me because I am Black and Jewish. I would say that the conversation that we're having is a little dated. And if you can look, most of folks that are on this call are not millennials. And millennials, as I was saying, millennials are already 40 years old. So if you realize that most people don't even talk, they don't know who Louis Farrakhan is. I remember as a little child about the remarks of Jesse Jackson when he was running and how deplorable and how we felt about this. But my background is, I was born at Cedar Sinai, so I was born Jewish under the Star of David at Cedar Sinai. Grew up in Los Angeles in the when I was very small, we lived in the Fairfax district. My great grandmother is from Oklahoma and comes from the background of Ashkenazi Jews and African Americans, as well as Native Americans. And in Los Angeles, we have a lot of folks with that kind of a background. So it's not something that's recent or married, or adopted or whatever. And in Los Angeles, as well as throughout the United States, there's so many Jews of color and so many Black Jews. And the issue that we're going to have going forward are Jews welcomed? All spectrum of Jews welcome in Jewish institutions. Are they welcome at Shabbat? Are they welcome in Jewish, institutions? Are they paid fairly? Are they, get, grants and other types of things? And so I just finished up being a fellow, one of the only Black Jews in San Francisco as a Jewish Federation fellow at the JCRC. Before that, I was a fellow at the Jewish Family and Children's Services, and before that, I was a fellow at the Oshman JCC in Palo Alto. And so, throughout those experiences, there's always been a lot of Jews of color that are with me. Whether we're Black, we're Latin, Latinx, Chinese, you name it. But the issues are the treatment that folks are getting inside, and the idea of a Jew is not necessarily Ashkenazi and white. And so these are the challenges going forward. It is not that past that that the professor spoke so eloquently of. Younger folks do not understand this past, do not know of this. We do not necessarily look at politicians. So, the issues that I would say today are like YIMBY. Here in California, when you look at YIMBY and Los Angeles and development, gentrification, displacement, issues that, are really resonating with folks today. When it comes to the Palestinian issue, you also have Jewish groups that are JOCs that are looking, at what is going on. And then you're looking at Blacks and Africans in Israel and how they're treated. You're looking at various things. So we cannot be hypocritical within our Jewish community and in Israel. And then, look at these things. And so this is the new, the new look at how Blacks and Jews interact.
Hey,
and
Carla,
really,
sorry to cut you off. We have limited time. So let me ask you
Sure.
two questions. How
Sure.
old are you?
I'm 40.
Okay. So you're part of this. And do you feel welcome when you go into Jewish environment?
Oh, I would say that I had a real challenge in my fellowship, and I was very happy to have Jews of color like Alana Kaufman and Avila and other folks at Dimensions that are Jewish organizations. There is a lot of wanting us to be seen and be a part of coalitions, but
Right.
there isn't a one of like working on these issues together.
Right.
And
Thank
so
you.
those are the issues. That's
Okay.
where we,
Thank you.
where the issues are.
Thank
Thanks.
you. I'm just going to stop right now. So, I think Carla's bringing up, I don't know if I agree with Carla fully, but I agree with her partially, that there is a major issue in the Jewish world within our own community. And it's exactly what Carla said, which is how to be more welcoming and accepting of Jews of color, because Jews of color, as you mentioned, Professor Kaufman, are 20% or more of our community. And I don't think we are that welcoming, but that does not get rid of the other major issue, which was what we've been talking about. And the people who are in this on right now are the people who are involved, maybe the older people in the Jewish community, involved in Black Jewish issues and involved in getting active or are active in politics. And so you've given us a guideline, but I think that they are two issues. I don't think that one cancels out the other. So
well,
I'm
and
glad that Carla could join us.
I also think that, what Carla's point is actually is a sign of hope. In other words, it would be bad if basically Jews were giving up on this issue or Blacks were giving up on this issue. I think what Jews of color are doing is kind of injecting this energy, and as Carla says, this new perspective and new opportunities to work out some of these problems. We should all be encouraging efforts like Carla's and others to address some of these problems on a local level, whether it's around housing or police or poverty or inequality, so that Blacks and Jews of color can kind of form new relationships and relationships that mean something to that generation, the way the civil rights movement meant so much to earlier generations. So I think in a way it's good news that there is this surge of energy, young energy, coming into Jewish organizations that are saying, hey, there are new issues, new people, and we want to start addressing those as well, not just live in the past.
So, we have just a few minutes. So I want to, address a minor issue that may plague this, and it's a critical race theory. And wanted to get your thoughts on it because I'm not an expert in it, but I've been following it to try to understand what is going on. And as far as I can tell, and there's some people have brought it up, so I'll bring it up. My perspective, again, and this does not represent CSP or anything, is that it's actually being used as a talking point within a certain part of the political spectrum, and it's not a real issue. But maybe I'm wrong. And I wanted to get your thoughts as to what's going on and where as Jewish people we should be, how we should be thinking about it.
So I think, like everything in life, it's good up to a point. And I think that one of the things that, journalistically, the 1619 project that the New York Times did, or the discussions of white privilege and so forth, I think are important. I think that, it's forced all of us to think about the institutions we live in, and are there ways in which they're not welcoming or have, systematically excluded people of color and so forth. And so in that way, I think it's been a good kind of intellectual reckoning. And there are always excesses. That's true of any new set of ideas. I think you're right in that I think the right wing has seized upon it as making it sound as if we're all going to have to start throwing out history textbooks and all that. I guess in the end, my feeling is these are new ideas. It's worth thinking about, but it's got to be grounded in the reality that we're a very complex, multiracial, multi-ethnic society. There's no one size that fits all anymore. And so I think that what we try to do in our classes, and what I think we all try to strive to do, is to listen to these different perspectives, take what makes sense, try to understand it. The same way Jews, frankly, it was very important for Jews to expose the role that anti-Semitism played, say, in college admissions at Harvard and Yale and Princeton for so many years, or the way it was so important to expose that Franklin Roosevelt didn't do as much as he could do to stop the Holocaust. The way the New York Times, even though it was owned by Jews, didn't cover the Holocaust when it was going on. It doesn't mean that you then treat these people as being pariahs or whatever, but you embrace the complexity of history. And so in that sense, I think that when it's used that way, it's important. But I do worry that in this increasingly polarized environment, it's becoming a cudgel where people on the left are saying, you've got to redo your whole curriculum. People on the right are saying, don't tell me what to think. And I think Biden, kind of in the center, just would like everybody to calm down. And I think that's what people like he and Kamala Harris and a lot of leading Black intellectuals feel as well.
So as I said, just a minor issue to discuss in the context of Jews as seeing ourselves as white, but being, seeing ourselves as Jews, but other people seeing us as white, how we fit into that issue and to Black Jewish issues and to many things in the American society. I guess the good news is that we are in the same boat, and the incredible rise of hate crimes over the last 4 years is not unique to Jews. Asian Americans, Black Americans, Jews, other minorities are really, Muslim Americans. We're kind of in it's an interesting time in America. We have been pushed back together. So maybe the question is, what do we do from here? And I think you've given us some answers, but anything you want to end on before we break?
Well, no, I think that's a great way to end it. I think that we are, unfortunately, at a time where a lot of the advances that we had fought for seem to be under threat. And I think that's, what did Abraham Heschel say? That, when he would go marching, he was praying with his feet. I'm not sure we want to go marching, but I think fighting again for things like for voting rights, fighting to end inequality, and also just trying to build connections with people on a personal level, and reaching out to African American colleagues and friends, trying to have a conversation, trying to have a dialogue, I think can bring us closer together. And it may not be as dramatic as the civil rights movement, but I think it's a start. And I'd like to see us all start on a personal level, and then build up to some bigger things.
Well, thank you so much, Howard. Want to know where you teach, and you're at Northeastern University. You'll send me the links. People can come to your class. We have some good articles I think I'll share with people. Rochelle, Ambersound ends with, we need multiple alliances with all marginalized communities. And I think we do. I think the incredible thing that I've seen, which I never thought I would see, is just the such a large percentage, or at least such a strong percentage of haters here in America. And they don't just hate us. They don't just hate us, but to see this bubbling up, this outpouring of anti-Semitism in the last 4 years, has been very scary, and it should push us to work with other groups who are also facing these hateful people. So we have our work set out for us, and there are great people who I can see, like Carla, who are doing this work, and we appreciate it, and we appreciate you for. Jonathan, for spending time with us and kind of giving us in 1 hour a history of where we were, how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. People have asked for your email. If you're okay with it, I will share it. We'll talk about how people can reach you. And I think that's it for now. So thank you, everybody, for being with us. 1 hour is definitely not enough for this topic, but it's something we wanted to get to, and something that I know Professor Kaufman feels very strongly about. So the deal was we would do Jews of Shanghai for Carl Cedar, and then we would do this issue for the rest of you. Yes, a lot to work on. It's nice to see our regulars, and like the Rubens are back, and it's nice to see a lot of new people. So go to occsp.net if you want to learn more about our topics and what we have coming up. But I'll guarantee you one thing, it's a variety of topics. We are not focused on one issue. We're focused on anything that would be of interest to the Jewish world and the Jewish community. This is one topic of many that are important, and I'll try to give you some follow-up reading and follow-up resources. Maybe Professor Kaufman will share with me some stuff, and maybe we'll see you in his classroom. So with that, take care, keep cool, start hydrating, start eating lots of pasta. You got a fast day coming up, and you got 24 hours to think of important issues. This should be one of them on your agenda. Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan. And Susan Glass, always good to see you as well. Yitzhak Bakal from Boston, I think. Nice to see you. Thank you. Okay, everybody. I got to go spend time with my kiddos. Take care. Bye, Louise. Bye, Phyllis Gilmore.